never be controlled.
We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
Why aren't we going to get
areas
control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus.
Out on the campaign trail today, President Trump headed to New Hampshire and then Maine. Former Vice President Joe Biden attended church this morning but had no in-person events planned. Democratic Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris made multiple campaign stops in Michigan today.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 48.
In Washington, D.C., where the Senate ended a filibuster and moved toward a confirmation vote on the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, Democrats raised concerns about the possibility Vice President Pence will attend the vote that is expected tomorrow. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer urged Democrats to limit their time on the floor after what he said were reports of Republican staff, including members of the senator's staff and the vice president's staff, testing positive for COVID-19.
The vice president, who's been exposed to 5 people with COVID-19, will ignore CDC guidelines to be here tomorrow, putting the health of everyone who works in this building at risk. It sets a terrible, terrible example for the American people.
New confirmed cases of COVID-19 continued at near daily record levels yesterday, and more patients are being hospitalized. Johns Hopkins University reported 83,718 new cases, just below the record high number reported Friday. Officials in 6 states, Alaska, Ohio, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, and Illinois, said they had new record high reports of coronavirus cases yesterday. And in another sign that the virus is resurging, the number of COVID-19 patients hospitalized is also rising. According to the COVID tracking project, 41,882 people were in hospitals in the U.S. yesterday, a number that has been increasing steadily over the past month, but is still below the record numbers in April and July that reached almost 60,000 per day. Around the world, there are now more than 42 million coronavirus infections, and more than 1.1 million people have died since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Afghanistan is claiming that its security forces killed a senior al-Qaeda leader who was on the FBI's most wanted list. The man, known as Abu Mushin al-Masri, was reportedly killed in a raid last week in the Ghazni province, about 90 miles southwest of the country's capital of Kabul. Afghanistan security services tweeted the news last night. Al-Masri was believed to be al-Qaeda's second in command. The news came hours after yesterday's suicide attack on an education center near Kabul. The death toll from that attack now stands at 24 killed, with 57 wounded, many of them young students. Today in Vatican City, Pope Francis announced the appointments of 13 new cardinals from 8 different countries. Francis made the surprise announcement to an audience in St. Peter's Square from his studio window. One of those nominated is the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Wilton Gregory, who would be the Catholic Church's first black cardinal from the U.S. Gregory, who was born in Chicago, previously served as Archbishop of Atlanta before being appointed to the Washington, D.C. Archdiocese last year. Gregory also made headlines in June when he criticized President Trump's visit to a Catholic shrine just a day after federal agents and police cleared demonstrators from the park in front of the White House as the president walked to a nearby church for photographs. For more news and to see our full Roads to Election 2020 series, visit pbs.org/newshour. Yesterday, New York State opened up early voting for the first time in a presidential election. Across New York City, lines snaked around polling places for blocks, and people waited hours in some locations. Both the city's main sporting arenas, Madison Square Garden in Manhattan and the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, have become makeshift polling centers. It's a move that was spurred in part by the athletes themselves. PBS NewsHour Weekend's Christopher Booker has more.
Under normal circumstances, in late October, the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York would most likely be starting the NBA season. As we all know, circumstances are not normal. But at least for the next couple of days, the Barclays Center will be bringing people back inside, not for a game, but to cast their vote.
This will be the largest public event that we've had here at Barclays Center since we shut down back in March.
John Abamonde is the CEO of BSE Global, the company that manages the Barclays Center.
It just became very apparent to us that there was a real need for the city to open up more voting places, more early voting places, And we have this magnificent facility here, lots of square footage, as you can tell, very, very centrally located.
This all comes in part after the summer saw organized and sustained calls for police reform following the death of George Floyd. Abamondi says Barclays approached the New York Board of Elections in June after protests erupted around the city. Other stadiums across the country became available after a player strike halted the already delayed NBA season in August following the shooting of Jacob Blake. As part of the negotiations to return, the Players Union asked that franchised-owned operated arenas be converted into voting facilities, whether for early voting or on Election Day.
The last time I was here was actually in June during the protests.
We welcomed the role that we played this summer when people felt that this was a place to come and express their point of view and advocate for social justice. And that's a cause that we support as well. So it seemed only natural that a place that had become a community gathering spot to seek change would now be a place where people could come to exercise their vote as well.
Executive Director of the New York Board of Elections, Michael Ryan, stresses while Barclays is the largest early voting location in Brooklyn, it's just one of 88 in New York.
4 years ago, we had about 125,000 absentee ballot applications. This year, we have already over 1 million, and the deadline hasn't yet passed.
He says New York expects to see larger than average voter turnout. And even with a space like Barclays, voters should be prepared for a wait. With early voting in New York City starting yesterday, on a weekend, voters may have had extra time for the hours-long line outside of Barclays, mirroring similar scenes that have played out in early voting lines across the country. And while it's unknown when there will be lines at Barclays again to watch the team in action, it seems the arena and its function has changed.
Do you think if the players had not been as active as they had been, that this would be happening?
You know, the fact that they spoke up the way they did is really, really helpful because it allows us to link arms in common cause. I think you have to give a lot of credit to our players. You know, they're very socially active. They care a lot about the communities, and they've used their platform and their voice to try to seek change.
I'm on the fence when it comes to my age group feeling compelled or feeling like they're important in this election, just because with me being a young African-American female, we don't feel like we have voices. So a lot of them say, well, but I don't have to vote. And that's not true. A no vote counts too.
As part of our ongoing series, Roads to Election 2020, we take a look at the Lone Star State of Texas, where races there are heating up. There's been unprecedented turnout among early voters, with 6.4 million Texans already casting their ballots as of last Thursday, according to the Texas Secretary of State. I recently spoke with public media partner KERA reporter Brett Jaspers, who joined us from Dallas. Is Texas actually close right now?
Well, if you're a poll person, the latest poll is even in the presidential race. We've also had a lot of early voting. The early votes that have come in already, early and mail votes, are 70% of the total turnout from 2016.
Do we know who these folks are that have come out?
People who had voted in Democratic primaries more heavily turned out in the first few days of early voting, but then people who voted in Republican primaries have caught up, although there's quite a bit of new registered voters, like 1.8 million newly registered voters this time.
Let's look further down the ballot. Senator Cornyn's seat is up. There's lots of representatives, obviously, are up again.
Right. Senator Cornyn, he's been in the Senate for 18 years. He's a Republican incumbent. His opponent is Democrat MJ Hagar. She's raising a lot of money in the last couple of months. In terms of the output that they're spending, it's relatively neck and neck, and she's really giving him a run for his money. The analysts, some say that Cornyn, his race, they think will kind of track a couple of points difference maybe from the presidential race, but it'll track pretty closely to it.
What about on the state legislature level?
That is actually the biggest political story in Texas this year, is the race for the state house, for control of the state house. So back in 2018, Democrats gained 12 seats. Now, in order to retake the state house, they need to win another 9 seats and retain all the ones that they have. So if Democrats get that control of that chamber in the next round of redistricting, they'll actually have some influence or some ability to block the gerrymandering of the Republicans, which was so influential in 2010.
You know, the past couple of weeks, it's been kind of a bizarre scenario of stories about how people in Texas are actually going to vote. If they wanted to put a ballot in, where would they go? It was kind of back and forth, one court after another overturned each other. Where do things stand today?
Most of the lawsuits seem to have concluded. There was a challenge to the extended early voting period that was lost. So the Republican Party in the state wanted to push back against Governor Abbott's extension of early voting. They lost that lawsuit, but other lawsuits, Republicans have won. For example, Governor Abbott restricted the number of places that a voter can drop off a ballot. He restricted that to just one place for the entire county. For example, Harris County, which has millions of people, that's where Houston is. And so that county is restricted to just one drop-off box. Whether or not that's going to be enough to kind of dampen people's spirits to voting, it's unclear. I talked to a woman earlier this week in Fort Worth, which is in North Texas, who said, I'm going to get a couple bottles of water, and I'm going to bring some crackers and some chips, and I'm going to sit, go step by step until I actually get to the polling station. I don't care how long it takes me. I'm going to get there early on Saturday. So people are thinking about their plan to vote.
Oh, that's good. What's driving most of the voters right now? Is it the presidential race? Is it the pandemic, the economic consequences? What's on top of mind?
The pandemic has been quite important here. We did have an earlier time in the very, very beginning, but then in June, there was a spike that people were really alarmed by. I would also say healthcare is a big issue here. Texas has the largest uninsured rate in the country. The people who run the state have decided not to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, and that's an issue that comes up constantly. Should we expand Medicaid? And I think those two issues together are motivating people quite a bit.
All right, Brett Jaspers, KERA, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Earlier this month, the Texas Regulatory Board voted to remove discrimination protections for LGBTQ and disabled persons seeking social work services. At the recommendation of Governor Greg Abbott, the Texas State Board of Social Work Examiners changed part of their code of conduct in a unanimous vote. The code prohibited social workers from turning away clients on the basis of disability, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Critics are urging lawmakers to reverse the decision. NewsHour Weekend's Yvette Feliciano spoke with Ricardo Martinez, CEO of Equality Texas, about what the change means for members of those communities.
Plainly, this is a very damning message that is sent to LGBTQ people and folks with disabilities, right? As a marginalized community, I think we get this pretty often, right? And this is a continued degradation of a very prosecuted, marginalized community that is really suffering at the moment, right? And to do this during a pandemic when people need access to mental health services and social workers, I think it sends the wrong message, and it adds some additional barriers and challenges that we really don't need at this time to get folks the medical care that they need.
The board voted unanimously to remove these discrimination protections based on a recommendation by Texas Governor Greg Abbott. How does this decision fit into the larger picture of the fight for LGBTQ rights in Texas?
Many Texans are not aware that LGBTQ people can legally be fired, refused housing, or denied services simply because of who they are here in Texas, and that is unkind, that is unfair, that's really unacceptable. Currently, Texas is one of 27 states where there are no protections from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the only way that we can achieve the freedom that LGBTQ people need to live, to work, to earn a living, to raise a family, and to contribute to our society fully is to pass a comprehensive statewide non-discrimination law that protects all people, including LGBTQ people, and that's going to be our top priority in the legislative session in 2021.
And how does the fight for LGBTQ rights in Texas intersect with the specific concerns of queer and trans immigrants and people of color in Texas?
We are still going through COVID, and our community lacks basic protections from discrimination in housing, employment, public accommodations, and healthcare. And those are the cornerstones of stability, right? And many folks are struggling with that stability. This is not an easy time. Many in our community have pre-existing health conditions that have left their immune system compromised or placed them in higher risk groups, right? So you add on top of that race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and many other identity markers, and it creates this multifaceted consequence for individuals in our community. We want to protect all of our members of the LGBTQ community, and I think some of us are predisposed or more at risk because of some of the classifications I just discussed.
Looking ahead to the November elections, what is your team doing to organize LGBTQ voters?
Our mission, one of the core values and one of the core tactics that we focus on really is education, right? Making sure that folks have the information that they need to make informed decisions at the polls. So early voting, the importance of voting down ballot, how to report issues with voting if you're experiencing any, educating voters on who the prolific filers of anti-LGBTQ bills are is also incredibly important, right? People should know who the folks are who are incumbents that have not been doing their job to protect their constituents.
Ricardo Martinez of Equality Texas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was convenient that I turned 18 for an election year, and so I came out with my mom to vote today. It didn't take very long, so I encourage everyone to get out and vote.
It's been 6 years since the death of 43-year-old Eric Garner, who died from being held in a chokehold after police confronted him for selling loose cigarettes on the street in Staten Island, New York in July of 2014. Since that incident, his final refrains of "I Can't Breathe" have become synonymous with national and global demonstrations calling for police reforms. Some change has come. Many jurisdictions have changed rules involving the use of chokeholds. Still, as with Eric Garner's death and others, many cases with police-involved deaths rarely bring an indictment or go to trial. Garner's family says for them, justice was not served. But a film released this past spring, now showing on the cable channel reels, chronicles the case that never was. NewsHour Weekend's Christopher Booker has more.
It's been 6 years since Eric Garner gasped, "I can't breathe." Words captured via a cell phone video, words the world has come to know, and words that prompted protests across the country. Activists, athletes, and Garner's wife, Esau Snipes Garner, and his family, asking that Officer Daniel Pantaleo be held accountable in a court of law for Garner's death. But that never happened. A grand jury declined to indict the New York police officer who used a chokehold on Garner, the case seemingly ending before it even started. But if an indictment had come, just what would a trial look like? And how would it proceed?
When the non-indictment came through, and it just hit me, like, I'm living in New York. Everyone who would have testified in this trial if it happened is probably within a 15 miles radius of me. And wouldn't it be interesting to put a trial on film, the trial that everybody thinks should have happened and won't happen?
In his film, American Trial, The Eric Garner Story, filmmaker Roy Messinger attempts to answer these questions. The director recruited Esau Snipes Garner to play herself in this unscripted film, as well as friends and witnesses who were there on the day of Eric Garner's death. The filmmaker also hired real lawyers to prosecute and defend the case, both sides calling expert witnesses throughout the trial. The only actor in the film was the gentleman who portrayed Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was never charged in connection with Garner's death. So what instructions did you give to the participants in the film as a director? What were you telling the participants to do?
Basically, I said, just be yourselves. I had a conversation with Esau when before she went on the stand, and she asked me, like, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to act? And I was like, don't act, just be you.
I would have loved to have done it in real life, like, an actual trial. So I was geared up for it, but it was hard. It was hard. I was so angry knowing that it was fake to you guys, but it's real to me.
So real that Snipes Garner says she found herself having difficulty keeping her cool as the Pantaleo defense team cross-examined her.
He came home every night, so I didn't need to go to Bay Street to visit him. I was ready to jump off. I mean, she literally came to me after everything was over and we went in the back and she was like, you know, this was fake, right? I really apologize because the anger that boiled up in me, I really wanted to jump off that stand and punch her in her face.
Well, this has been a very personal and emotional time for Snipes Garner. Messinger, who is from Israel, initially approached Eric Garner's death as a manslaughter case that would lead to the prosecution of Officer Pantaleo.
And I was convinced, and I couldn't imagine another possibility. There's a video of him choking another man. And the reason why I mentioned this and the fact that I'm a foreigner is because I think that this is really one of those examples of things that happen in the United States that just don't happen in other countries, or at least not in the same kind of frequency.
Compared to much of the developed world, Messinger is right. More people are killed by the police in the US than any other wealthy nation. And this past spring, just as the film was being released, came the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, offering tragic support for Messinger's argument. What do you think this film offers to the current conversation, particularly thinking just this past summer, we saw a very similar incident with George Floyd?
Right, so I think that's the million-dollar question, right? In every important juncture of the film, people always tell me, oh, what a timely film, because there had just been another black man who was killed by the police a week ago, 2 weeks ago, or that same month. Because it's really all just about one thing, and that's just systemic racism, right? There was no trial in the Eric Garner case, and that's what the film is about. How is it possible that this trial that you're seeing in front of you is fake? And the reason is because it was a black man who was killed by a white police officer.
I spoke with Breonna Taylor's mom, and she wanted to know what should she expect, and I told her just don't give up, and just keep fighting.
And Snipes Garner also spoke with George Floyd's brother.
I just told him that I feel his pain. I felt his pain for 6 years. I can't imagine what a person would be thinking them last few minutes of their life, knowing that the breath is being drained from their bodies, but that he mattered, and the world is showing him that he mattered.
Since the death of Eric Garner, Officer Pantaleo was fired from his job. The state of New York also passed a law banning police chokeholds. But for all these measures and the continuing discussions surrounding Garner's death, Snipes feels there's something missing. It's now been 6 years since Eric's death. What do you think people don't understand about what it means for you?
They don't understand that he was a father, he was a husband, he was a grandfather, he was a son, an uncle, a cousin,